She built this company with her bare hands. Today, a man in a $4,000 suit just told her to get out of his way. In her own lobby, in front of cameras, downtown Atlanta, 7:42 in the morning. The kind of October morning that makes glass towers look like they are on fire. All that early light, catching the edges of steel and turning everything gold for exactly the kind of people who believe they deserve it. Town cars lined up along Peachtree Street. Press suits moving in packs. The sharp rhythmic click of expensive shoes on marble, the sound of people who have learned to walk, like their time is worth more than yours. Inside the Crestmont Technologies headquarters, 60 floors of steel and ambition and carefully curated corporate identity, 300 people were already moving fast, talking loud, performing confidence like their quarterly bonuses depended on it, because today they did. The annual leadership summit, investors flown in from New York and San Francisco, board members and senior directors and a local news crew already setting up near the main stage in the atrium, the anchor adjusting her earpiece while a camera operator swept the lobby for the kind of visual that said, "Success said power," said this company is going somewhere you want to follow. The kind of day where everyone wanted to be seen, except one person. She came in through the side entrance, the one off the service alley, on the south end of the building, the entrance without the marble floors and the automatic glass doors that opened like they were welcoming royalty. This entrance had a keypad and a heavy steel handle and a smell of cleaning solution that clung to the air year-round. Gray uniform, worn work shoes the kind built for standing 12 hours straight, not for making an impression. A cap pulled low over silver natural hair that caught no one's attention. Simple glasses, a mop bucket on wheels that squeaked softly with every push, a small persistent sound that nobody ever turned around to locate. Nobody looked up. Nobody ever did. Evelyn Brooks moved through the lobby, the way water moves through a city, finding the spaces between things steady and unhurried, and going exactly where she intended to go, which was everywhere. She passed the new marble reception desk and felt the faintest pull of recognition. Not pride exactly, more like memory. $12 million that renovation cost. She remembered approving the budget on a Tuesday afternoon, 31 months ago, sitting at the long table in the 58th floor conference room, while the interior design team walked her through material samples, and the project lead kept using the phrase elevated brand experience, and Evelyn had asked 3 questions. Practical questions about durability and maintenance costs, and whether the cleaning staff would need special equipment, and the project lead had looked at her like those were the least interesting questions she had ever been asked. She said nothing now. She noticed everything now. She stopped near the east corridor just past the second set of elevator banks, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see 3 junior analysts eating breakfast outside, on a bench near the loading dock exit, which was the only outdoor space on the building's east side that wasn't technically restricted. 2 of them were young black women, early 20s, still in their coats because October in Atlanta had turned sharp this week. One of them was eating something wrapped in foil, probably brought from home, the kind of breakfast you brought from home when the cafe inside the building wouldn't open its doors to you. Evelyn had designed that cafe to be open to every employee in the building. She had been explicit about it years ago when the space was being planned. She had said it in a meeting and followed it up in writing and believed until this moment that it had stayed that way. She took out a small notebook from her front pocket, wrote something down, closed it. Then she looked back at the lobby, all that glass, all that light, all that expensive performance of inclusivity and innovation and we're all in this together. And her expression didn't change, not visibly, not in any way a stranger could read. But her eyes went quiet in a way that should have frightened someone if anyone had been paying attention. Near the security desk, a tall man in a guard uniform noticed her. He was already moving toward the east corridor door when she approached it, and he held it open without being asked, not with a show of it, just held it. The way someone holds a door when they see a person coming, and it costs nothing to be decent. He nodded once, she nodded back. His name was Marcus Reed. 31 years old, former Army II, tours 3 years on this security post. He had seen thousands of people walk through this building and had developed the way veterans sometimes do, an instinct for the ones worth watching. Not because they were threatening, because they were real in a way most people in this building never quite managed to be. Something about this woman had always made him pay attention on the handful of times he had seen her before. He couldn't have said why. He went back to his post. Then the revolving door on the north side of the lobby exploded open and the temperature of the room changed. Brandon Whitaker did not walk into spaces. He claimed them. There was a specific physics to the way he moved, the way the crowd parted slightly without being asked, the way sound seemed to orient toward him, as if the room understood instinctively who it was supposed to be arranged around. Custom suit, charcoal with a faint pinstripe, the kind of suit that cost enough to make other men feel underdressed just standing near it. A Rolex on his left wrist, catching the atrium light every time he gestured, which was often because Brandon Whitaker gestured when he talked, the way some people breathe automatically constantly, as if stillness were a kind of weakness. Hair so perfectly styled, it looked like a legal document. 2 junior associates trailing him at a careful distance. Close enough to be useful, far enough not to crowd him. He was on the phone, laughing. The laugh of a man who had never once in his 44 years genuinely doubted whether he belonged in a room. Tell them the deck better be flawless. He said into the phone, I am not standing up there with a typo. On slide 4 in front of $200 million worth of investors. Do you understand what I'm saying? That is not a small ask. That is the entire point. He was moving fast and not watching where he was going, which was also something about Brandon Whitaker, the assumption that the path would clear itself, and it nearly did, except for the mop bucket. He almost walked straight into it. He caught himself at the last second, one hand shooting out, and for a moment he just stood there looking down at the bucket, the way a person looks at a pothole on a street they pay taxes on, something that should have been handled, something that was somebody else's failure to manage. He didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He kept walking already back in his conversation, but then just loud enough to carry across a 10-foot radius, just soft enough to sound offhand rather than intentional, he said it. Can someone coordinate with housekeeping? I need these carts off the main floor before the cameras go live. This isn't the look we're going for today. His assistant was already typing. Evelyn watched him walk away. She watched the 2 junior associates scramble to keep his pace. She watched the people nearby who had heard it, who had registered it, and who had decided in the half second it takes to make that kind of decision that it was not their concern. Nobody corrected him. Nobody said actually contracted staff are permitted in this area. Nobody looked at the woman with the mop bucket to see if she had heard. Because in buildings like this one, in companies that printed diversity commitments in the annual report, and hung inclusion posters in the elevator banks, and hosted summits where the word values appeared on every 3rd slide, certain people were still treated like furniture, present, useful, not worth the acknowledgement of a glance. Evelyn took out her notebook again. She wrote one more thing down. Then she pushed the mop bucket toward the service corridor, slow and steady, the wheels squeaking their small, ignored sound across the marble floor. And if anyone in that lobby had stopped their performing and their positioning and their urgent, important movement long enough to look at her face, they might have noticed something that didn't belong in a cleaning uniform. They might have noticed that she looked exactly like a person who already knew how this day was going to end. The 12th floor was quieter than the lobby, the way upper floors always were. During summit mornings, everybody either downstairs performing or locked behind conference room doors, rehearsing their performance. Evelyn worked her way along the corridor outside the main conference room, restocking the supply cart she had parked near the utility closet at the end of the hall. Extra trash liners, paper towels, the small, unglamorous inventory of a building that required constant maintenance, whether anyone thought about it or not. She heard them before she saw them. 2 men in their mid-40s, both in summit lanyards, both carrying coffee, both laughing in the easy way of people who have never had to be careful about who might be listening. The first one said something about the diversity section of the summit program, and how it looked great on paper, real progressive, very on-brand, and the second one laughed and said, sure, but at the end of the day, the decisions get made by people who have actually built something. You know what I mean? Not just people who check the right boxes on a hiring form. The first one laughed again. They turned the corner and were gone. Evelyn kept restocking the cart. Her jaw tightened once, barely the way a muscle moves when something lands that you refuse to let show. She placed a roll of paper towels on the second shelf, then another. She had heard variations of that conversation for 40 years, in warehouses, in bank lobbies, In boardrooms where she was sometimes the only woman and always the only black woman and occasionally the only person in the room who had ever worked a job that left calluses on her hands. She had heard it so many times that she had learned to carry it the way you carry weather, something that is happening around you, something you did not cause and cannot stop, something you simply move through. She was still moving through it when Nicole Harris appeared at the far end of the hallway. Nicole was Crestmont's human resources manager, 31 years old, always polished, always purposeful, the kind of person who moved through a building like she was quietly auditing it. She saw Evelyn and her expression shifted, not into anything cruel, not into anything that could be named easily, just a kind of managerial discomfort, the look of someone who has spotted a logistical problem and intends to resolve it efficiently. She walked over and lowered her voice slightly, the tone of someone being helpful. "Excuse me, cleaning staff should be using the service elevator, just so you know." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Of course," she said. "Thank you." Nicole nodded once satisfied and continued down the hall. She had handled it. The corridor near the press walk-through was tidy again. That was the extent of what she had considered. She did not consider whether the instruction was correct. She did not consider whether Evelyn had been there for a legitimate reason. She had seen something that looked out of place, and she had moved it along the way. You move a chair that is blocking a doorway without asking whether the chair had somewhere important to be. At the corner of the hallway near the ceiling, a small internal security camera held its fixed position. It had been there for 3 years. Nobody looked at it. Nobody thought about it. It recorded everything it could see, which was quite a lot. The 4th floor break room was nothing like the executive cafe 2 floors above it. No exposed brick, no pour-over coffee station, no catered pastry display. Plastic chairs, 2 long tables, a refrigerator with a handwritten note on it, asking people to label their food, a microwave that hummed slightly off-key. The kind of room that told you exactly where you stood in a building's internal hierarchy without saying a word about it. Evelyn sat at the far end of the second table, with a cup of coffee she had poured from the communal pot, and a sandwich she had brought in her bag. Around her, a handful of facilities and support staff moved in and out, brief lunch breaks, quick conversations, the rhythm of people with 30 minutes before they needed to be somewhere else. She was halfway through her sandwich when the young woman appeared in the doorway. She looked to be in her mid-20s, a black woman in a blazer that was slightly too big at the shoulders, the kind of blazer you buy when you are new and not entirely sure yet what the dress code actually means in practice. She scanned the room, and her eyes landed on the empty chair across from Evelyn, and she hesitated in the way people hesitate when they want something and are not sure they are allowed to want it. "Is this seat taken?" she asked. "It is not," Evelyn said. The young woman sat down and introduced herself as Jasmine, Junior Data Analyst, 7 months in. She said it the way people say their title when they are still deciding whether it fits them, like trying on a coat in a store, assessing whether it is really theirs. They talked, or mostly Jasmine talked, about the summit chaos, about the way senior directors had been treating the junior analysts all morning, like decorative elements useful for carrying things, and standing in the background of photographs, but not particularly worth directing eye contact toward. Evelyn listened in the way she had always listened, with the full weight of her attention, which was something people noticed without being able to say exactly what they were noticing. She did not ask Jasmine what her role was. She already knew that. She asked what Jasmine loved about data work, and the question landed differently than Jasmine expected. You could see it in the small pause before she answered, the way her shoulders dropped half an inch, the way her voice changed register, slightly moving from professional to genuine. She said she loved the moment when a pattern emerged from what looked like noise. She said it felt like the data was trying to tell you something, and your job was just to get quiet enough to hear it. Evelyn nodded slowly. Jasmine looked at the table for a moment and then said she had almost not taken this job. She had almost turned it down because she kept thinking she was not quite ready, not quite polished enough, not quite the kind of person that a company like Crestmont was really looking for. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Belonging isn't given, it's sometimes built." Jasmine looked at her. She didn't say anything back, and Evelyn did not explain further, and the sentence sat between them on that plastic table in that unglamorous break room and did something to Jasmine that she would not fully understand until much later. The cocktail hour began at 4:30 in the atrium. By then, the lobby had transformed soft lighting, replacing the fluorescent glare of the workday servers, moving through the crowd, with small plates and glasses, the hum of 100 conversations layering over each other into a single ambient sound of self-congratulation. The summit was winding toward its close, and the mood was loose and self-assured, the mood of people who believed the day had gone well because it had gone well for them. Evelyn was on the far west side of the lobby near the base of the staircase that curved up toward the mezzanine. She was there because she was supposed to be there assigned to that area for end-of-day cleanup, as the event wound down, which was her job and her cover, and the reason she had every right to be exactly where she was standing. Brandon Whitaker was 20 feet away, deep in conversation with two men in expensive watches and a woman holding a press badge. A journalist from the local television station, whose camera operator stood just off to the side, camera on his shoulder, technically in standby mode, which meant the feed was live but not broadcasting, which meant it was recording without recording the way so many things in that building happened. Brandon was holding a glass of bourbon and doing what Brandon did best, which was performing effortless authority for an audience. Then he turned to gesture towards something behind him, and his elbow nearly caught the edge of Evelyn's cart. He turned around. He looked at the cart. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite recognition, just the slow arrival of an irritation he had already been carrying. "Jesus," he said loud enough that the two investors and the journalist all turned to look. "I asked for housekeeping to be out of the public areas. Why is this still happening?" It was not a question. He looked directly at Evelyn, and his voice shifted into the patient explanatory register of someone who believes they are being extraordinarily reasonable. "Ma'am, I need you to take your cart and go. There are important people here today. This isn't the time or the place." Evelyn looked at him steadily. She did not look away. She did not change her expression. "I'll be out of your way shortly," she said. Brandon's jaw tightened. He shook his head slightly the way you shake your head, at a child who has misunderstood a simple instruction. "No," he said, and now his voice was louder, pitched for the small crowd that had begun to orient itself toward the exchange, the way crowds always orient toward friction. "Not shortly. Now. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is a major corporate event. You can clean later." A few executives near the edge of the gathering shifted their weight. Someone looked at their phone. A woman in a navy blazer turned slightly away, not leaving, just angling herself toward not having seen it. Nobody said anything. Brandon looked around at the faces near him, and something about their attention seemed to fuel him, the way an audience fuels a performance even when the audience is uncomfortable. "I don't know why this keeps happening," he said, spreading his hands slightly, addressing the room, now more than Evelyn. "Is HR asleep?" Two of the investors laughed short and nervous, the laugh of people who are not sure what they are laughing at, but understand that laughing is the socially safer option. Evelyn said nothing. She moved her cart, slowly, with the full, unbothered dignity of someone who has decided exactly how much of herself this moment is worth. As she turned toward the service corridor, Marcus Reed stood near the security desk, 15 feet away. His arms were at his sides. His face was still. But his eyes followed Brandon with the careful cataloging attention of a man who had learned in the army that the things worth remembering were the things people did when they thought nobody was keeping score. He was keeping score. Nicole Harris had caught the last 2 minutes of it from near the east pillar. She stood with her tablet held against her chest and watched Brandon laugh with the investors and felt the discomfort move through her like a low current. He was senior. It was a high-pressure day. The woman had technically been in a restricted event zone. Nicole told herself she would check the access protocol when she got back to her desk. She took out her phone, started to type something, then stopped. Whatever she had almost written, she did not write it. She put the phone back in her pocket and walked toward the elevator bank, her footsteps quick and precise on the marble floor. In the service corridor off the west lobby, Evelyn stopped walking. She leaned her back against the wall just for a moment in the particular way of someone who does not allow themselves this very often and is allowing it now because the corridor was empty and nobody was watching, and she was 67 years old and had been on her feet since 6 in the morning. She breathed. A panel of polished steel on the wall across from her caught her reflection, distorted slightly. The gray uniform and the silver hair and the glasses and the face that had seen more than any room in this building would ever know. She looked at herself for a long moment, Then she reached into her front pocket and took out the small notebook. She wrote 2 words. She closed the notebook. She pushed off from the wall and picked up the cart handle and moved forward steady, as she had always been, the wheels turning quietly in the empty corridor, carrying her toward whatever came next. The town car was parked on Lucky Street, 2 blocks north of the building engine, idling softly against the October cold. Evelyn sat in the back seat and looked out the window at nothing in particular. Her driver, a quiet man named Gerald, who had worked for her for 9 years, knew better than to pull to the front entrance. He knew better than to ask questions on nights like this one. He simply drove to the spot she preferred and waited, and that was the arrangement. And it had worked for 9 years because Gerald understood something most people never learned, which was that the most useful thing you can offer someone is the space to be exactly where they are. Evelyn set the notebook on the seat beside her. 11 visits. She had made 11 of these trips over the last decade, slipping into the building she had founded the same way she had entered it tonight, through the side entrance in the gray uniform, with the mop bucket and the cap, and the invisibility that came with both. She had done it because she believed that a company's real character was not visible at the executive level. It was visible at the edges, in the break rooms and the service corridors and the small daily exchanges that happened when nobody with power was watching. She had seen things on those visits that troubled her. A supervisor on the 3rd floor who spoke to the male staff like they were an inconvenience. A pattern of junior employees, mostly women, mostly people of color, consistently excluded from internal communications about promotion cycles. Small things, the kind of things that never made it into reports because they happened below the threshold of what anyone thought worth reporting. She had taken notes each time. The notes had become lists. The lists had become quiet directives, communicated through Victor to the appropriate departments, worded carefully enough that nobody traced them back to an unannounced visit from the founder. But tonight was the worst she had seen. Not because of the cruelty of it. Not exactly, there were crueler things in the world, and she had seen most of them. It was the ease of it that sat in her chest and would not move. The way Brandon had turned to the crowd after. The way the crowd had laughed. She pressed her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. She was 7 years old, and it was 3 in the morning in Birmingham, and her mother's alarm was going off in the next room, the small clock radio on the nightstand, and she could hear her mother moving through the dark apartment, getting dressed, making the coffee she would carry in a thermos to the house she cleaned across town. Evelyn would fall back asleep and wake up for school, and her mother would not be home yet, and sometimes not home until after dinner, and this was simply the shape of their days. Years later, when Evelyn was 17 and working her first cleaning job at an office complex in downtown Birmingham, she would bring her textbooks to the break room during the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the floors were done, and she had a window before the bathrooms needed to start. She would sit under the fluorescent light and read about computer systems, about logistics networks, about the mathematics of routing and efficiency. And sometimes the security guard would walk past the break room door and see her there, and look at her, the way people looked at things that didn't quite fit the category they had prepared for. She kept reading anyway. She drove her first delivery truck at 23, a second-hand Ford with a heating system that worked only when it felt like it. January on the highway between Atlanta and Decatur. Ice on the road, her first client, a small medical supply company that had taken a chance on a woman with a used truck and a business plan written on legal pad paper. She remembered the way her hands felt on the wheel that morning, cold and certain and completely her own. The 3 banks had each told her no in their own polished way. Not enough collateral, not enough operating history, not enough. She remembered sitting in the parking lot after the 3rd one and thinking with a clarity that surprised her even then that their opinion of her ceiling was not information she was required to accept. The warehouse on Fulton Industrial Boulevard was where it really began. One used computer, a second-hand desk. The routing algorithm she had been building in her head for 2 years, finally on a screen, finally real. She had been 41 years old, and she had worked for it every day of those 41 years. And she had known sitting in that warehouse at midnight, with the code running for the first time, without errors, that her mother had been right. You scrub floors so hard they shine, baby. That's not shame, that's pride. Evelyn opened her eyes. She picked up the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment, not opening it, just holding it. Then Gerald said quietly from the front seat, "Whenever you're ready, Ms. Brooks," she said. "Give me 5 more minutes, Gerald." He nodded and looked back at the street, and she looked at the notebook, and the city moved around them in the dark. 3 miles away in the parking garage beneath the Crestmont building, Jasmine Carter sat in her car with the engine off and her phone pressed to her ear, and the overhead fluorescent light of the garage making everything look slightly more tired than it actually was. Her mother picked up on the third ring. Jasmine said, "You know what? Something weird happened today." She told her about the woman in the cleaning uniform, the gray cap and the worn shoes, and the way she had asked about the data work. Not what Jasmine did, but what she loved about it. Like, those were 2 different questions worth distinguishing between. Her mother said, "Was she nice?" Jasmine looked at the steering wheel. She felt like somebody mama, she said. I don't know how to explain it. Like somebody who had nothing to prove to anybody in that building. Her mother said that sounded like a nice lady, and asked if Jasmine had eaten dinner yet. Jasmine said she had, and they talked for a few more minutes about other things. And when she hung up, she sat in the quiet of the garage and felt that sentence still there. Belonging isn't given, it's sometimes built. Sitting in her chest, like something she had been waiting to hear for a long time, without knowing she was waiting. She picked up her phone and typed Evelyn Brooks Crestmont founder into the search bar. A 2009 press release came up, the kind of sparse archive page that predated the era of corporate image management, just a few paragraphs about the company's early growth. A quote attributed to the founder, "No photograph." Jasmine read it twice. She scrolled down. There was nothing else of use. She put the phone down. She sat with the question a little longer, then started the car and drove home, and the question came with her. Marcus filed his security log at 9:47 after his shift ended and before he changed out of his uniform because he preferred to do paperwork while the details were still precise in his mind. He wrote up the atrium disruption in the standard format. Date, time, location, parties, involved nature of the incident. He kept the language neutral because neutral language was what the form required. Then he added 1 line at the bottom of the entry outside the standard fields in the space marked additional observations. He wrote that the employee conduct toward contracted staff appeared unprofessional and potentially escalatory, and that he recommended a review of lobby access protocol for event days. He looked at it for a moment. His supervisor would likely route it to a folder that existed primarily to give paperwork somewhere to go. He understood this. He had worked in enough institutions to know that the purpose of certain forms was not resolution, but the appearance of process. He submitted it anyway. He had learned in the Army that the record mattered even when nobody was reading it yet. You wrote it down because someday someone might need to know what happened, and your job was to make sure they could find out. He changed out of his uniform and walked to his car and drove home in the dark. The summit dinner was still going when Brandon told the story for the 3rd time. He had refined it slightly with each telling the way stories get refined in the retelling, the details sharpening his own role, clarifying into something more decisive and necessary. He was standing near the bar with his bourbon and 3 people whose attention he had earned, and he said he had literally had to tell the cleaning lady to leave 3 times during a live media walkthrough, because apparently the message had not gotten through the first 2 times. Someone in the circle said the invisible hand of middle management keeping the optics clean. Laughter moved through the group. Brandon shook his head with the tolerant exasperation of someone who considers themselves burdened by competence. There was a man at the edge of the circle who had arrived late to the dinner and had not been announced, which was the way he preferred to arrive at things. He was 72 years old, in a blazer that was well made but understated, and he was holding a glass of water, and he had been in that circle for 4 minutes without anyone asking his name. His name was Victor Langford. He was the chairman of the board of Crestmont Technologies. He had known Evelyn Brooks for 31 years. He did not laugh. His expression was almost completely neutral as Brandon finished the story and someone else began another one, and the circle shifted and rearranged. Almost. Evelyn was in her hotel room by 10:30. The kind of mid-range business hotel she always used for these visits, nothing that would invite questions about who was paying the bill. She sat at the small desk near the window and opened the notebook to the page she had written on in the service corridor. 2 words, board review. Below them, she began a new list. She wrote Brandon Whitaker's name first, then the date, then a precise condensed account of what had occurred in the atrium, noting the presence of the television journalist and camera operator. She wrote Nicole Harris's name below that, with the time and location of the corridor interaction. She wrote a separate line about the cafe key cards and the three analysts eating outside in October. Her handwriting was small, and even the handwriting of someone who had spent years writing in margins. She turned back 2 pages to the entries from her last visit 18 months earlier. The name she had written then had been a floor supervisor named Garrett, a pattern of documented complaints from the mail and facilities staff that had never reached HR. Garrett was no longer employed at Crestmont. The HR complaint process had been restructured. Neither change had come with a public explanation. She turned back 1 more page, the visit before that. A different set of names, a different quiet correction. She looked at the current page for a long time. Then her phone buzzed on the desk beside her, a text from a number she recognized immediately. It said, "I was there tonight. I saw it." She looked at the message for a moment, then typed back 3 words and set the phone down. So did the cameras. She closed the notebook and looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. All those lit windows against the dark, and somewhere in that arrangement of glass and light was the building she had started in a warehouse with 1 computer and a second-hand truck, and a mother's voice that had never once let her believe the floor she was standing on was as low as she was going to go. She was at the building by 7:15 the next morning, not through the side entrance this time, through the parking structure on the west side, which connected via a private elevator to the 58th floor, an elevator that required a specific access card that had not been issued to any member of the cleaning staff and had never appeared in any employee directory because it had been built for 1 person and 1 person only. Victor was already there when she arrived. He had made the coffee himself, which was something she had always appreciated about him. The absence of performance in private, the way he moved in a room when there was nobody to impress. He was 72 years old and had the bearing of a man who had learned decades ago that real authority did not require an audience. He poured a cup and set it in front of her without asking how she took it. He had known how she took it for 31 years. She set the notebook on the table between them. They went through it page by page. The cafe key cards and the 3 analysts eating outside in October. Nicole Harris in the corridor. The service elevator instruction delivered with the confidence of someone who had never questioned whether the instruction was correct. The 2 managers on the 12th floor and their conversation about who had actually built something. The atrium, the cart, the bourbon, the crowd, the laughter. Victor listened without interrupting. He had a quality she had always valued in him, the ability to receive information without immediately converting it into a response to let the weight of a thing actually land before deciding what to do with it. When she finished, he looked at the notebook for a moment. He asked how many of those incidents Brandon was directly responsible for. Evelyn said, today him specifically 3. The pattern behind him is cultural. That's the review. Victor said, what do you want to do? She said, I want to know who knew, and said nothing. That's always the real answer, not just what happened, who saw it and decided it wasn't their problem. Victor nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlanta skyline was bright and clear, 60 stories of city laid out below them, like something she had once imagined from a warehouse on Fulton Industrial Boulevard, and had spent 35 years building toward. He made 1 phone call before she left the room, not to Marcus's supervisor, not to the standard security desk. He called the VP of corporate security, directly a man named Darius Webb, who had been in his role for 6 years, and understood from the first sentence of the conversation what kind of request this was and what kind of authorization was behind it. Victor asked him to preserve all lobby and floor camera footage from the previous 18 hours for a board-level internal review. He said the official reason was a routine annual audit, which was technically accurate. Crestmont conducted annual audits. This one had simply been initiated earlier than scheduled. Darius Webb was quiet for a moment after Victor gave the authorization code. The code was not one he had ever seen used before. He cross-referenced it in the system, and then he was quiet for a different kind of moment, the moment of a man recalibrating his understanding of what was happening. He processed the request in under 4 minutes. What neither Victor nor Evelyn had known, until Darius called back 20 minutes later, was that the atrium footage was not the only recording. The camera operator from the local television station had been running a live buffer the entire Evening Standard practice for a crew, covering a corporate event, capturing everything for potential use without committing to broadcast. The buffer had preserved 90 minutes of footage, including the full atrium exchange, Brandon's voice clear and directed. Evelyn's response clear and composed, the crowd's laughter audible in the background. The station's server had it. It had not been broadcast. It existed. Darius said he would coordinate with the station's legal department through proper channels. Victor said to move carefully and correctly, and to document every step. Darius said he understood. Evelyn spent Tuesday afternoon on the 7th floor. She had submitted a facilities access request through the cleaning contractor's account, logged as a supply inventory check for the archive room corridor, which gave her a legitimate reason to be in that section of the building, with a clipboard and a set of printed organizational charts she had obtained through the same account. She was reviewing the charts when she heard footsteps stop behind her. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. Jasmine said, "You're not actually on the cleaning staff, are you?" It was not quite a question. Evelyn turned and looked at her steadily. She let the pause sit for a moment, long enough to be deliberate. Then she said, "Why do you ask?" Jasmine looked at the organizational charts in Evelyn's hands. She looked at Evelyn's face. She said, "Because yesterday you asked me what I love about data work, not what I do. Nobody here asks that. The people here ask what you do, so they can figure out where you rank. You ask something different." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. She said, "You notice things. That's rare." She did not confirm. She did not deny. She folded the organizational charts under her arm and walked down the corridor and did not look back, and Jasmine stood in the hallway outside the archive room with her heart moving in her chest, at a rate she could not entirely account for, holding the question like an object that had been placed in her hands without explanation. Wednesday morning, the atrium was full again. The summit's closing session was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and the room had arranged itself in the way of people who believed they knew how the next 2 hours would go. Investors in the good seats, senior directors visible and composed, junior staff distributed along the sides and back present but peripheral the way they had been all week. Brandon Whitaker was in the front row, second seat from the left, jacket on one arm, resting across the back of the empty seat beside him. He had slept well. The dinner had gone well. He had told the story one more time over breakfast, and it had landed well. He was the kind of man who measured days by how well things had landed. Victor Langford took the stage at 9:03. He had been listed on the program as presenting a brief board update, standard language. What was not on the program was the annotation that had been added to the digital agenda that morning for those who had checked their email early enough to see it, that read special address, unscheduled, please be seated by 9. Victor stood at the podium and looked out at the room with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned that rooms would quiet themselves if you simply waited. The room quieted. He said, 35 years ago, this company was started by one person. Most of you have never met her. Some of you never thought to look her up. A few people shifted. Someone in the third row leaned slightly toward the person beside them. Victor said she was in this building on Monday. The room stirred, not loudly. The kind of stir that moves through a seated crowd when the atmosphere changes and nobody is sure yet in which direction. He said she was in this building doing what she has done 11 times over the last decade, watching how this company treats the people it claims to value. He paused. He said, "I would like to introduce the founder and majority shareholder of Crestmont Technologies." The side door to the left of the stage opened. She walked in. Same silver hair, same simple glasses. A clean blazer navy, well fitted but not elaborate. The same unhurried walk, the walk of someone who had never needed to perform arrival, because arrival was simply a thing that happened when you moved from one place to another. She did not need the room to react. She did not pause at the door to let the reaction build. She simply came in and walked toward the podium the way she had walked through every room in her life, like she had already decided what she was there to do. The processing took a few seconds. Confusion first, the natural response to information that does not fit the category prepared for it. Then a few phones came out in the middle, rows people pulling up images cross-referencing, and on their screens was the same face, older now by 15 years, but the same face, the same eyes behind the same kind of simple glasses. The woman who had been pushing a mop bucket through the lobby 48 hours ago was standing at the podium of her own company. Brandon Whitaker's face changed. It did not drain. It rearranged. The settled confidence of the front row rearranged itself into something else, something that moved through his jaw and his eyes, and the slight forward shift of his shoulders, and for just a moment his gaze went to the side exit and came back the involuntary calculation of a man whose body understood the situation slightly faster than his mind was willing to accept it. Evelyn set her hands on the edges of the podium. She looked out at the room all of it, every investor and executive and junior analyst and board member and journalist and security officer standing near the back wall looked back at her. She let it breathe. Then she said, "Good morning." 2 words. Quiet and level, and carrying the full, unhurried weight of every floor she had ever scrubbed, every loan she had ever been denied, every room that had looked past her, and every room that had underestimated what it was looking at. She let those 2 words settle. Then she said, "I want to begin by thanking the people who treated every person in this building with dignity on Monday. You know who you are." Her eyes moved across the room and came to rest briefly but unmistakably on a tall man in a security uniform, standing near the back wall with his arms at his sides and his face composed and still. Marcus Reed did not move, but something in his expression shifted just slightly, the way a person's face shifts when they are recognized by someone they respect. Evelyn held that for 1 second. Then her gaze moved. It traveled across the room and found the front row and settled on the second seat from the left. And when it did, she did not look away, and the man in that seat for the first time all week had nothing to say. She spoke for 14 minutes. Not 15, not 20. 14 minutes measured and deliberate the address of a woman who had learned long ago that the length of what you say has no relationship to the weight of it. She did not raise her voice once. She talked about what she had seen on Monday morning, not in the language of accusation, not in the language of grievance, but in the plain specific language of observation. She described 3 junior analysts eating breakfast outside in October because their key cards did not open the executive cafe. She described a contract worker being directed to use the service elevator by a staff member who had no authority to give that direction and no apparent interest in whether it was correct. She described the loading dock bench and the foil-wrapped breakfast, and the particular quality of exclusion that does not announce itself as exclusion because it has been normalized so completely that nobody involved thinks to question it. She said a company's true character is not in its mission statement. It is in how it treats the people nobody is watching. I was watching. The room was perfectly still. Not the performed stillness of an audience managing its reaction. The genuine stillness of people who have been caught not individually, not by name, but collectively in the quiet, ongoing act of looking away from things they should have looked at, and who are now sitting with that in a room where the person speaking built every chair they are sitting in. She did not say Brandon Whitaker's name, not once. She didn't need to. The break was called at 9:57. Brandon moved before most people had stood up from their seats. He had the specific urgency of someone running a calculation, in real time, assessing who in the room still had goodwill to offer, and how quickly he could reach them. He found 2 board members near the coffee station on the east side of the atrium. He positioned himself with his back to the main crowd, his voice low, and controlled the voice of a man reframing a situation he had already decided was being misrepresented. He said, "Obviously, I had no idea who she was. This is clearly some kind of setup. What reasonable person would assume that a woman in a cleaning uniform at a corporate summit was the founder of the company? That is not a reasonable assumption for anyone to make." One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Holt, who had been on the Crestmont board for 8 years, and had the expression of someone who had heard every variety of this particular speech, looked at him without changing her face. She said, "Brandon, stop talking." He stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the second board member, who had found something to study in the middle distance. He walked away from the coffee station and found Nicole Harris near the elevator bank. She was standing with her tablet held against her chest, the way she always held it when she was uncertain, like it was something to stand behind. He said her name. He said, "You were there. You saw the situation on Monday. It was a logistics issue, the event floor, the restricted zones. There was nothing personal about any of it. And if someone is suggesting otherwise, then that is a characterization that does not reflect what actually happened." Nicole looked at him. For 7 months, she had worked in this building, and in that time, she had developed a fluency in the language of powerful men who needed things smoothed over, who needed witnesses to remember things slightly differently than they had occurred, who needed the people around them to perform a version of the story that kept the original version at a manageable distance. She had been fluent in that language for most of her professional life. She looked at her shoes. She said, "I can't help you with this." Brandon stood in the atrium of a building full of people, and there was nobody in it who would stand next to him. By noon, the footage was in the hands of Crestmont's general counsel. The CCTV file from the atrium camera, high resolution, time-stamped, capturing 4 minutes and 31 seconds of the exchange with full audio. Marcus Reed's incident log, submitted the previous evening through the standard security reporting system with its one additional line about conduct that appeared unprofessional and potentially escalatory, and the television station's buffer footage, obtained through a formal legal request that had been filed at 9:15 that morning and processed with a turnaround that reflected the circumstances, the station's legal department understanding quickly what kind of footage they were holding and what kind of company was requesting it. The general counsel reviewed everything with 2 members of the legal team and the head of human resources, a deliberate and methodical woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been in HR for 20 years and had seen every kind of workplace conduct situation, and who watched the atrium footage twice without expression before she spoke. She said the conduct documented in the footage fell clearly under Section 7.3 of Crestmont's Workplace Dignity Standards. The provision covering demeaning or dismissive treatment of staff, regardless of employment classification. She said the presence of media at the time of the incident created additional liability considerations that legal would need to assess separately. She said the standard timeline for a formal review under Section 7.3 was 5 to 10 business days. She said Brandon Whitaker would be placed on administrative leave effective end of business today. The word moved through the building in less than an hour, not through any official communication, through the ordinary human infrastructure of shared space and proximity, the way significant information always travels in buildings, where people spend 8 to 10 hours a day in close company. Someone told someone. That person told 2 people. By 3 in the afternoon, there was not a floor in the 60-story building where people did not know. Nicole was called in at 2. The meeting was in a small conference room on the 9th floor. Sandra Okafor was there, and a woman Nicole did not recognize who was introduced as a designee from the office of the founder, which was a phrase that landed in Nicole's chest with a specific weight. Sandra asked her to describe what she had witnessed on Monday, and Nicole did, and her account was accurate because she was not a dishonest person. She had never been a dishonest person. Dishonesty was not the thing she was being held accountable for. Then Sandra asked why no report had been filed following either the corridor interaction or the atrium incident. Nicole opened her mouth. She said, "I didn't think it rose to the level of." She stopped. Sandra did not fill the silence. She did not need to. The sentence had answered itself in the stopping of it in the place where the explanation ran out, because there was no explanation that held up against the simple fact of what she had seen and what she had chosen to do with it. Nicole was not terminated. She was placed on a formal performance improvement plan, 90 days with monthly reviews. Her role in the incident would be included in the internal review summary that would be shared with the board. She drove to the parking garage after the meeting and sat in her car. She sat there for a long time. She thought about the corridor on the 12th floor and the way she had said what she said to the woman in the cleaning uniform and walked away satisfied. And she thought about the atrium and the 2 minutes she had stood at the east pillar watching, and the phone she had taken out, and the things she had almost typed and had not typed. And she thought about every other moment in her professional life where she had made the same calculation, where someone needed someone to say something and she had decided that someone did not have to be her. She took out her phone. She opened a new document and she began to write down exactly what she had seen. Not for the investigation already had what it needed. She wrote it for herself, because she understood now that the record mattered, that Marcus Reed had understood something she was only beginning to learn, which was that the things you witness belong to you, and the only question is what you do with them. Evelyn came through the 7th floor at 4:15. She was in the navy blazer now, no cap, no cart, no uniform. She walked the corridor the way she always walked corridors in this building, taking in the details, reading the space, the way she had been reading spaces since she was 17 years old, with a textbook on a break room table. She found Jasmine at her desk near the window, staring at her screen, with the particular unfocused quality of someone who is not actually reading what is in front of them. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the desk. She said, "You doing okay?" Jasmine looked up at her. She looked at the blazer. She looked at the face. She had known since the archive room corridor had known, in the way you know things that have not been confirmed, and now it was confirmed, and she was sitting with the full weight of it. She said, "You could have told me." Evelyn said, "Would you have talked to me the same way if I had?" Jasmine looked at her for a long moment. She said no, probably not. Evelyn said, "That's why I didn't." She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and set a small card on the corner of Jasmine's desk. Plain white, 2 phone numbers and an email address, nothing else printed on it. She said, "I have a board fellowship program for analysts under 30. 1 slot opens in January. The application is 3 questions. I read everyone personally." She did not wait for a response. She walked back toward the corridor and was gone, and Jasmine sat at her desk with the card in her hand and the window behind her and the city below and the full, complicated, overwhelming understanding of what the last 3 days had actually been. That evening at 7:42, a post appeared on a professional networking site. The account belonged to someone who worked in corporate events, someone who had been at the summit in a contracted capacity and had no particular loyalty to anyone involved, and had spent 3 days watching something unfold that she felt the professional world deserved to know about, in the careful, technically unverifiable language of someone who understood exactly how much to say. The post said "Wild Day at a Fortune 500 summit in Atlanta. A founder showed up in a cleaning uniform to see how her company really operates. Let's just say some people showed exactly who they are. It offered no names, no company name, no identifying details. Within 3 hours, it had 14,000 reactions and 3,200 shares, and the comments were not kind to whoever some people referred to. And the story that had begun in a lobby on a Monday morning with a mop bucket and a man who did not apologize was no longer contained inside the 60 floors of glass and steel where it had started. It was outside now, and outside it moved differently. By Thursday morning, the tip had reached the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. It came through the paper's general tip line, submitted anonymously through the online portal, but it was specific in the way that anonymous tips are specific when they come from someone who was actually there, someone who had been in the atrium on Monday evening and had understood what they were watching in real time and had spent 2 days deciding what to do about it. The tip named no individuals. It named the company. It described the incident with enough precision, the event the floor, the exchange the presence of media, the internal investigation that had been initiated, that the journalist who received it, a business reporter named Diane Marsh, who had covered Atlanta's corporate sector for 11 years, understood within 4 minutes of reading it that this was real and that it was going to matter. She spent Thursday and most of Friday making calls. She contacted Crestmont's communications department, which confirmed an internal review was underway and offered no further comment. She contacted 2 sources inside the building who spoke on background. She confirmed through the television station's public affairs office that buffer footage from the summit existed and was being handled through legal channels. She did not pressure anyone. She did not need to. The story was already fully formed. Her job was to verify it carefully enough that it would hold. The piece ran Friday morning, 1,200 words precise and restrained, under the headline, "Crestmont Technologies Founder's Undercover Visit Triggers Internal Investigation." It named no employees. That was an editorial decision made deliberately, the paper's position being that the named individuals were subject to an ongoing process, and that the story was not about them specifically, but about what their behavior represented. It described the atrium incident in specific detail. It noted the existence of the buffer footage. It quoted Crestmont's confirmation of the review without elaboration. By noon Friday, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By 2 in the afternoon, it was everywhere. The conversation online divided as online conversations always divide into those who understood the point immediately, and those who were determined not to. On one side, the outrage was straightforward and it was loud. On LinkedIn, professionals who had spent careers navigating the specific texture of being underestimated in the corporate spaces were writing about it in terms that were personal and specific and recognizable to anyone who had lived it. On Reddit, The threads in several communities were running hundreds of comments deep within hours. On the other side, there were people who argued that Brandon could not reasonably have known, that the situation was ambiguous, that anyone might have done the same thing, that the response was disproportionate to what was in there framing a misunderstanding. That argument had a short lifespan. Someone in one of the original threads replied to it with a single sentence. The reply said he was rude to her before he knew. That's the whole point. 47,000 likes by Saturday morning. The sentence became the story's spine in public discourse. The line that kept getting quoted, kept getting shared, kept appearing in the comment sections of every new article that ran, because it was the line that cut through every qualifying argument and every good faith misreading and landed on the thing that was actually true, which was that the question of who she was had never been the point, and the people who were making it the point were demonstrating in real time exactly the problem she had gone in to observe. Stories like this, real-life stories about power and dignity and what people do when they think no one important is watching, do not stay quiet. They never do. They find the cracks in the careful management of corporate image and they move through them, and once they are outside, they belong to everyone. Brandon Whitaker's LinkedIn profile was located by Friday afternoon. His most recent posts were about servant leadership, about the responsibility of those at the top to lift others up, about the kind of culture that brought out the best in people. The comments that began appearing under those posts were pointed in the specific way of people who have been given an exact and documented contrast to work with. He made his profile private on Friday evening. That action was screenshotted and posted within 20 minutes. The screenshot spread faster than the original profile had. The act of concealment read to the people watching as confirmation of everything. A man who had spent years building a public professional identity around the language of leadership and people and values had, when the test came performed, the opposite of every word he had ever posted, and then when the record became uncomfortable, had tried to make the record disappear. His phone did not stop. His wife called Friday night, and the conversation was long and not good. His father called Saturday morning, a retired man from Marietta, who had built a small business of his own over 40 years and who said very little and meant all of it. A business school classmate who sat on the board of a mid-sized logistics firm in Charlotte called Saturday afternoon and said, in the direct language of someone who had known Brandon for 20 years and was no longer able to afford the association that he needed to get ahead of this in some way, because the silence was making it worse. Brandon issued no statement. He had nothing to say that would help him, and he knew it. His silence sat in the public conversation like an answer, which in a way it was. By Monday, his administrative leave had been extended pending the conclusion of the formal review. The extension was communicated internally through the standard HR process. It did not need to be communicated externally. People already knew. The communications team at Crestmont had prepared a full statement by Saturday. It ran 4 paragraphs, carefully worded the language of institutional accountability, calibrated to acknowledge without over-explainings, to commit without over-promising. It had been worked on by 3 people across 2 drafts, and the team was reasonably satisfied with it. Evelyn read it on Saturday morning and sent it back with edits. She cut 60% of it. What remained was 4 sentences. The statement that went out said, "I visit this company because I believe in it. I visit quietly because I want to see what it really is, not what it performs to be. What I saw this week reflected both the best and the worst of what we've built. We will do better. Not because the world is watching, because it's right." She declined every interview request. There were many: television, print, podcast, digital. She declined them all through a 1-line response from her office that said she had nothing to add to the statement and wished the company's team her full confidence as the review proceeded. The 4-sentence statement was shared 220,000 times in 48 hours. People quoted the last 2 sentences most, not because the world is watching, because it's right. It was the sentence that made people stop scrolling, the sentence that said something about the difference between compliance and character, between performing values and holding them, and it spread the way things spread when they named something that people have been trying to find words for. A journalist from a national business publication reached out to Marcus Reed through the building's public information office on Friday afternoon. Marcus was on his shift when the request came through. He read it on his break, standing near the service corridor where Evelyn had leaned against the wall Tuesday evening, and he thought about it for a few minutes. He sent a response that said He appreciated the interest and had no comment to offer beyond what was already in the public record. The journalist published a piece anyway, drawing on the internal review documents that Crestmont had made available as part of its transparency process. The incident log Marcus had filed was in those documents. His one additional line, the line about conduct that appeared unprofessional and potentially escalatory, and the recommendation to review lobby access protocol, was quoted in 4 separate articles over the following week. He became briefly the kind of quietly famous that attaches to people who do the ordinary right thing at an extraordinary moment. Strangers on LinkedIn tagged him in posts. Someone made a graphic with his words on it. A news anchor read the line on air and called it the most important sentence filed in any corporate security log she had ever seen. He was back at his post Monday morning. Same uniform, same posture, the same steady, unhurried nod to the people coming through the door, the nod that said, "I see you and you are worth seeing," which was the only thing he had ever been trying to say. The building opened around him and the day began, and the city moved in its ordinary way. Outside the glass and inside the lobby, the marble floor caught the morning light, the way it always did. The way it had on Monday when a woman in a gray uniform had pushed a mop bucket through it and written 2 words in a small notebook, and understood that the day was going to end differently than anyone in the room expected. Different it had. 3 weeks after the summit, the board of Crestmont Technologies released a formal announcement that used none of the language corporations typically reach for when they are trying to appear accountable without actually being accountable. There was no rebrand, no new tagline, no full-page advertisement in a business publication about the company's renewed commitment to its values. What there was instead was a document 7 pages specific and procedural outlining a workplace culture review to be conducted by an external firm with no prior relationship to Crestmont, with a mandate that covered employee treatment at every level of the organization, access equity across all facility systems, including the cafe, dignity standards for contracted staff, and the culture around incident reporting, specifically the question of why certain things that should have been reported had not been. Victor Langford chaired the oversight committee. He had not needed to be asked. He had called Evelyn the morning the board met and told her he intended to chair it personally, and she had said she would not have wanted anyone else, and that had been the end of that conversation. The 2-tier cafe system was abolished before the quarter closed. The keycard access was reconfigured so that every person who worked in the building, full-time employee or contracted staff, held the same facility access. The announcement was made without ceremony, a single internal memo. 2 paragraphs effective date listed no editorial about what it meant or what it corrected. The correction itself was the statement. Marcus Reed was offered a promotion to corporate security supervisor 3 weeks after the story broke. His direct supervisor delivered the offer in person, which Marcus appreciated. He asked for 24 hours to think about it, which he used to think about it seriously, and then he accepted, which he had known from the first hour he would do. He moved into the new role on the first Monday of November, and on that morning he stood at his new desk on the 4th floor and thought about the incident log he had filed 6 weeks earlier, and the one additional line he had added, and the choice he had made to submit it, even knowing it would likely go nowhere, and he thought that sometimes going nowhere was not the right way to measure where something went. Brandon Whitaker's formal review concluded in the 2nd week of November. The finding was termination for cause. The specific citation was violation of Section 7.3 of the company's workplace dignity standards, supported by the CCTV footage the television station's buffer, recording Marcus's incident log and the accounts of 3 additional witnesses whose statements had been collected during the review process. The decision was made by Sandra Okafor in Human Resources and confirmed by the General Counsel. It was not made by Evelyn. She had not been asked to weigh in and had not offered to. The system she had spent 35 years building, the policies and the standards and the accountability structures that were supposed to make a company function correctly, regardless of who was watching, had done what it was designed to do when someone finally activated it properly. She had built the mechanism. The mechanism had run. 6 weeks after the summit, Nicole Harris completed the first month of her performance improvement plan. She had filed 3 internal reports in those 6 weeks. The first 2 were straightforward documentation of incidents she had observed, small things, the kind of things she had been observing, and not filing for the better part of 7 months. The third was more significant. It identified a pattern of exclusionary behavior in a department on the 11th floor. A senior manager who had been systematically leaving 2 junior employees off meeting invitations and internal communications in ways that were not accidental. The report was specific and documented and took her 2 evenings to write. Her supervisor noted the change without making a production of it. The notation went into her file. The performance improvement plan continued. She was not redeemed in a moment. There was no conversation in which someone told her she had made it right. That was not how making things right worked, and she understood that now in a way she had not understood it before, that accountability was not an event you arrived at and finished, but a practice you maintained one report at a time, one choice at a time, in the ordinary, unremarkable daily process of deciding what kind of person you were going to be when it cost you something. She sent Jasmine a message on a Tuesday evening. It said, "I should have said something Monday. I'm sorry." She did not explain it or qualify it or ask for anything in return. She sent it and put her phone face down on the table and did not check it for the rest of the night. Jasmine read the message and sat with it for a long time. She did not respond that evening, but she did not delete it either, and in the morning it was still there, and she read it again, and she thought that some things needed to be received before they could be answered, and that receiving was its own kind of work. 8 weeks after the summit, Jasmine submitted her application for the board fellowship. The application had 3 questions. The first asked what problem she wanted to solve. The second asked who had taught her to see it. She wrote her answers to both of those in one sitting, the words coming clearly the way words come when you have been thinking about something for long enough that the thinking has already done most of the writing. The third question stopped her. It said, "What will you do when no one is watching?" She sat with it for 2 days. She typed several versions and deleted them all because they were true, but not fully true. They were the answer she thought was expected, rather than the answer that was real. On the second evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the cursor blinking in the empty field, and she thought about a woman in a gray uniform pushing a mop bucket through a lobby that she owned, choosing observation over announcement, choosing to find out the truth rather than perform the version of it that was easier to live with. She typed, "I will try to do what she did, show up anyway, do the work, trust that what is right does not need an audience." She submitted the application before she could reconsider the honesty of it. 2 weeks later, her phone rang at 11:15 on a Wednesday morning. It was a number she did not recognize. She answered it at her desk, and the woman on the other end introduced herself as calling from the office of Evelyn Brooks and said that Jasmine had been selected for the January fellowship cohort and that orientation materials would follow by email. Jasmine said, "Thank you." She said it twice. She kept her voice steady through the call and through the 3 minutes after it ended, during which she sat at her desk and stared at her screen and did not trust herself to speak to anyone. She took the elevator to the parking garage at lunch, the same garage where she had sat in her car 8 weeks earlier, on the phone with her mother, trying to explain why a woman in a cleaning uniform had felt like somebody. She sat in the driver's seat and called her mother, and when her mother answered and said hello, Jasmine's voice broke on the first word. She cried for a few minutes. Good tears, the kind that come from a place that is not grief, but its opposite, the release of something held tightly for a long time, the feeling of a door opening that you had almost stopped believing would. Her mother cried a little too, which was how Jasmine knew it was real. The following October, on a Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, a woman in a gray cleaning uniform came in through the side entrance of the Crestmont Technologies building. She moved through the lobby the way she always moved through it, steady and unhurried, finding the spaces between things, watching everything, announcing nothing. The mop bucket's wheels turned quietly on the marble floor. She passed the cafe. The doors were open. Inside, junior analysts and contracted maintenance staff and administrative coordinators and senior directors all occupied the same space at the same tables, with the same access to the same coffee, which was exactly what the space had always been designed to be. She stopped near the east corridor. A security officer she had not seen before held the door open as she approached. He nodded with the easy, unperformed respect of someone who had been told by a supervisor named Marcus Reed that every person who moved through this building deserved to be seen. She nodded back. She moved through the lobby, and near the main reception area, she noticed a young woman standing slightly apart from the morning flow, maybe 24 years old, in a blazer that was slightly too big at the shoulders, looking at the 60-story atrium above her, with the expression of someone who is not sure yet whether they belong in a place this large. Evelyn caught her eye. She smiled, not the smile of someone with something to offer or something to prove, just the smile of one person acknowledging another, saying without words, "I see you. You are here, that is enough for now." The young woman smiled back uncertain, but steadied the way people are steadied when someone looks at them like they are worth looking at. Evelyn moved on. She was watching. She was always watching. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a gray uniform and a pair of worn shoes. Sometimes it moves through a room that it owns without telling anyone, because the point was never the announcement. The point was always what you found out when you arrived without one. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone decided not to see, and the most important question is not what that person will do when she is finally seen. The most important question is what you did before she was. This is the kind of story, one of those touching stories, one of those real-life stories about dignity and silence, and the ordinary courage of people who do the right thing in the moment when it costs them something that asks you something when it is over. Not what you would have done as Evelyn, not what you would have done as Brandon, but what you would have done as the people in the middle, the ones who saw it, the ones who heard it, the ones who stood at the edge of the moment and made a calculation about whether it was their problem. Most of us are never the founder. Most of us are the witnesses. And the story of what we do with what we see is the only story that is actually ours to write. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone you know, or a moment you witnessed, or a choice you made or did not make, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this one survive because people who believe they matter pass them forward. Leave a comment and tell us whose role in this story did you recognize yourself in. We will read everyone.